In this week's lecture, we're going to look at labeling, and the first part, there'll be actually two parts to this particular lecture. In the first part, we're going to look at something of the general labeling laws. Certainly, there have been a number of iterations, particularly as it relates to the nutrient label and nutritional labeling. We'll look at some of the general regulations in the first part of the lecture, and then when we go on to part two, provide some examples of the labels that we can use and what those labels would look like based on the number of square inches of space for actually including that information. That varies with the different food products, certainly. And then in the last part of that second lecture, we're going to look at the two types of claims that can actually be made on food products. We'll look at nutrient content claims, what they are, what some examples are, what the limiting factors may be in actually making a nutrient content claim. And then we're going to look at the health claims and the type of health claims that are actually allowed under the regulations. So to begin with, we're going to look at labeling regulations as they apply to foods that are regulated by the FDA. And the FDA typically regulates about 80% of the foods in the food supply. The other 20% is regulated by the USDA. And we'll say a little bit very briefly about labeling as it relates to USDA food products, which primarily eggs and meat products, meat and poultry. So let's look at the requirements for labeling of food products. And the first thing we're going to look at is what are the actual laws that have been established that would relate to actual labeling of food products. Certainly one that we've talked about already is the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and the fact that it does details standards of identity, which are extremely important as it applies certainly to some food products, and does have some information related to labeling. Then we're going to look at the effect of the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act of 1967, what that really means and what that relates to in terms of labeling of the food products. Then another important regulation was the Nutritional Labeling and Education Act of 1990. This was the first regulations that come out where we actually had a nutrient label and nutritional information provided on food products. That has since been updated actually, and the FDA has actually changed the actual nutrients that now are required to be on these labels. They removed a couple that were on there previously, added a couple others, and did something else, including added sugars. And then there's labeling laws in progress, at least, I would say, related to genetically modified foods and then genetically modified ingredients that are used in other food products. And as we looked at this labeling, it started to come about in 2016. As we get to 2018 and beginning to get into 2019, there are some other aspects of this that we'll talk about. We'll also talk about this when we talk about biotechnology later in the semester. And then the Tariff Act of 1930 deals with country of origin only. And there's been some things that have happened relative to country of origin labeling as well that will be discussed a little later in the class. So the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic applies to all foods, and this includes packaged and unpackaged food, foods that are being sold wholesale, institutional sales, and consumer products. And also applies to ingredients and the finished products. You think about some of the ingredients that might be used in foods, such as some of the oils, certainly, that would be used in making baked goods, would be an example. Again, we have spices that are used as well as ingredients in food products. So let's look at some definitions. The definition of the label is a display of written, printed, or graphic matter on the immediate container. And if you go to the supermarket and you look at any food product that's being displayed there, any of that information that's present on that particular package is part of the label. The term labeling refers to the labels plus any other material on the package. Oftentimes you'll see food products that might have something attached with an elastic or that provides some further information, perhaps on preparation, maybe something relative to the actual manufacture of that product. We see this quite often with products that are being processed in small kitchens, products that are being manufactured in Maine for sale to consumers. So if we look at the Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act actual definition for label, on the package in which the food is offered for retail sale, that's the label. Labeling is the printed material accompanying a particular product. The Fair Packaging Act and Labeling Act applies to packaged products intended for retail sales to and consumption by consumers. This particular act does not apply to products that are non-consumer products and non-retail products. So products that are going into wholesale, maybe going into institutional markets, those products are exempt from the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. So let's look at the individual packages as we look at labeling. The principal display panel is actually defined in the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. So if you want to know any information relative to the principal display panel, what's required, what it looks like, it can be found in this particular act. And it's the principal display panel, the PDP, is that part of the label that's most likely to be displayed in the supermarket, be presented as well, shown or examined. In other words, when you go into the supermarket and you're going down the supermarket aisle and you see products displayed there on the shelf, that particular information that you see directly in front of you, say if it's with a pasta product, whether it's a canned good, that becomes the principal display panel. So that's what you would normally see under normal conditions that's going to be displayed for retail sale to you. There is also an alternate principal display panel, and these are packages that may be designed to be displayed in more than one position. Some of the baked goods, some of the packaged cookies certainly can be displayed so that you're actually looking at the whole package, or the greatest area of the package. But also the size may be also an alternate principal display panel, because they may be put on the shelf in that format. The information required to be on the principal display panel also must be on all alternate principal display panels. So let's look at some examples from the FDA website. They provide this information certainly for people that may be getting into new packages. As you can see, the snack cakes, if you look at those, you're primarily going to see what's noted as the principal display. That's the way it's typically probably going to be displayed on the grocery store shelf. But it may be that the grocer decides to turn it on its side and display them that way, so that they may be stacked one on top of the other. And this provides us with the alternate principal display panel. You can see the same thing with the package of cookies as well, where what's the principal display panel, but also they may be displayed in a different fashion, and this becomes the alternate principal display panel. Most often, as you go in the supermarket, you're going to probably see the principal display panel is the one that's going to be there for the consumer, because it's more eye-catching. It's more apt to be, it's a bigger, certainly, and what would probably catch the consumer's eye more quickly than being displayed in the other fashion. So there is some size requirements for the principally displayed panel. The size of that panel determines the minimum type size for declaration of the net quantity of contents. So the size of the principal display panel is the height times the width of rectangular packages, so like the cookies and the cakes that were displayed in the previous slide. To determine the actual size of that principal display panel, we would multiply the height times the width. For cylindrical containers, say such as beans, canned corn, Pringles in a can, the size of the principal display panel is 40% of the height times the circumference of the cylindrical container. And for all other types of containers, is 40% of the total surface of that container is considered to be the size of the principal display panel. Exclusions in size of the principal display panel. There are some exclusions in determining the size. The tops, bottoms, and flanges of cans are not considered when determining the actual size, as we look at that actual quantitation. Shoulders, necks, and heels of bottles or jars are not included when we're determining the actual size of the principal display panel. And the seal area of flexible film packages, again, is not included when we're determining the size of the principal display panel. And certainly you see that certainly with some cookie products where you have a flange area where the actual package is sealed. That particular material or part of the packaging would not be included when we're trying to determine the actual size of the principal display panel. And the information panel is actually not mentioned in the 1938 Federal Food, Drugs, Cosmetic Act or in the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. So there's no mention of what the information panel or the IP would be in either of these particular two regulations. But it is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations on 21 CFR 101.2, and the information panel is defined as that part of the label immediately contiguous and to the right of the principal display panel, facing the principal display panel. So if you were looking at the snack cakes in one of the previous slides, and you're looking at it face on, the information panel is going to be contiguous to the right hand side of that principal display panel. And size matters. All information on the principal display panel and information panel should be prominent and conspicuous, and no letters or numbers can be less than 1/16 of an inch high. So there is some control over the size, and this is important so that it's readily available and can be readily seen by the consumer. So if we look at location of the information panel, as well as how we choose the area, how to actually calculate the area. If we look at the cake mix, you can see as you face it, the principal display panel is that area that you're looking directly at. And to find this on a rectangular package is just the height times the width. And as you can see, the information panel on this is directly to the right of the principal display panel. And again, we go to this glass jar, we look at the circumference of the jar times the height. And again, we exclude the shoulder of the jar and we include and the heel of the jar. They're not included in determining the actual area for the principal display panel. You can see where the principal display panel is, and again, directly to the right of that is the information panel. And then again, as we go to the sealed areas of this particular bag, they're again not included in determining the width. And you can see again the information panel here, as well as the principal display panel. And the size of the principal display panel in this instance is going to be height times the width, whereas in the cylindrical container it is 40% of the height times the circumference. So what information is required in labeling? The common name or statement of identity. Food for retail sale or ingredients in processed foods must be labeled with the name of the product. And this must be on the principal display panel. The name should not be false or misleading. And again, this would get us back to what we find in the 1938 Federal Food, Drug, Cosmetic Act that says misbranding or mislabeling certainly is a violation, and that product would be, in those cases, considered to be misbranded or mislabeled, and then would have to be removed from the shelf. If it's an imitation of another food, then it must state that it is an imitation. And an example might be ask for examples, but if you think of vanilla extract, you can buy pure vanilla extract as a flavoring material. Very, very expensive, but you can also buy imitation vanilla. And again, it tells you that it is imitation. It's not pure vanilla. Name specified in a standard if it's covered by a standard of identity. If we go back and look at jams and jellies as examples, and we look at the standard of identity for a jam, it actually tells you within that standard how you have to actually label that product as. If it's a single fruit product, it would be, say, raspberry jam. If it's a mixed product of maybe two or more, and you wanted to use all of the fruits that are used, you certainly can use the term mixed berry jam. But if you wanted to include all of those particular fruits in the name of the jam, you would start with the one that's there in the predominant amount that would be listed first. So if raspberries were there, say more than a blueberry raspberry jam, it would be blueberry raspberry jam. Probably a really good example of that is if we look at strawberry rhubarb jams as they're sold. Always you see strawberries first because strawberries are always there in greater quantity on a weight basis than certainly is rhubarb. So it's always strawberry rhubarb jam. I don't know of any cases where I've seen it rhubarb strawberry because of the tartness of the rhubarb. That's usually there in much smaller amounts. It's covered by a standard identity. The name specified must be used, and I provided you with, I think, a couple examples of that. You can probably think of others as well. If the particular product is not covered by a standard identity, the common or usual name may be used. A fanciful name may be used if it's understood by the consumers. And I think of a couple examples that might be fanciful names. Cocoa Puffs, kind of a fanciful name, but most consumers understand what that particular product happens to be. I guess you might consider Rice Krispies somewhat of a fanciful name, although it does directly relate to rice being in the product and it being certainly crisp. But there are certainly other examples you can think of fanciful names that have been used for in naming a particular food product. And certainly, as the regulations state, those can be used as long as it's understood that the consumer would actually know what that particular product is. So we also have regulations related to naming of flavored products. If you're specifying the flavor in the name of a product, use natural only if all natural flavors are being used. We'll talk a little bit about natural later on in the semester because the FDA has been sort of struggling with how one would define natural or all natural. If you're using artificial flavorings to simulate that flavor of the product, then you must use the term artificial. And I'll provide an example in the next couple of slides. Relative type size requirements for naturally flavored products. So the word flavored must be in type size at least 1/2 of that's used for the name of the flavor. So if we look at an example, we have blueberries and the flavor must be at least 1/2 the size of the term blueberry. So this would be a product blueberry flavored. We would be using an all-natural flavoring in this case. It's not imitation because we don't state that. If we go to artificial flavored, then it must be at least 1/2 the size of the flavor, and the flavor must be at least 1/2 the size of the product. So if we go back to the blueberry example, and we look at muffins, and then we have blueberries, and then the artificially flavored has to be 1/2 the size of blueberry, and blueberry is 1/2 the size of muffins in terms of relative type size. And this is done so that it's easy to see by the consumer, although when you get down to artificial flavored being that much smaller than blueberries, sometimes it may not be actually that easy to see without spending some time really looking at the particular product. The type size for the name of a product must be a size reasonably related to the most prominent printed matter. So this actually permits an exercise of considerable judgment. There really is no regulation other than this one statement. And the main thing is don't be misleading in the name of the product. That's what would probably get a company in the most trouble relative to FDA regulations relating to labeling. Forms of the product should be included with the name, and certainly as you go through the supermarket you will see a number of products where the form of the product is actually included. You can either get whole mushrooms in a can or you can get pieces. You can get slices or halves, as in peaches. You can get diced in the case of pineapple, get sliced in the case of pineapple as well. For bread, sliced or unsliced, as in bread or buns, are another example. So the actual form of the product is included with the name so that you as a consumer will know what that product is going to look like once you open the packaging. It's not necessary if the form can be seen through the package, say bread versus hamburger buns. Now you get into some breads. Wonder Bread's one where the actual packaging had tended to be white, so you really can't see the form of the bread in that package, and in that case they would be required to say sliced bread, or if it happened to be unsliced, it would say that as well. When you go to the deli and look at some of these products, they're in clear packaging material. You can see very easily whether they're sliced or unsliced bread. The name of the product must be generally parallel to the base of the package as it's displayed for sale. And the term generally parallel, as it's written in the regulations, is not defined. Ingredient statements. The ingredient statement was required by the 1938 Federal Food and Drug Cosmetic Act if that food is composed of 2 or more ingredients. In the statement, the ingredient statement be in one of 2 places. It may be on the principal display panel or on the information panel. The common or usual name of the ingredients needs to be used. And a couple examples, protein hydrolysate is sometimes used, and that's defined as what it is under 21 CFR 102.22, and then crab meat as well is defined in the Code of Federal Regulations in 21 CFR 102.5. So if you go to 21 CFR 102, you can find a list of the common or usual names of ingredients that may be used in food products, and the ingredient statement need to include those as they're defined in those regulations. And again, there are type size requirements for the ingredient statement. They can't be less than 1/16 of an inch. There are some exceptions for very small packages. If you get into a small package, say of crackers, where you wanted the actual ingredient statement on the actual small package of the crackers, rather than say that you've got 8 small packages within a larger package, where you will have that on the either the principal display panel or the information panel of that larger package. But if you wanted to have that on the smaller package, the individual package, then the package being very, very small, then you wouldn't need to have it as 1/16 of an inch. It could be smaller. The size of the small letter O is used if the ingredient statement is in lowercase letters. If you are using uppercase letters for your ingredient statement or your list of ingredients, then it has to be the size of the capital letter O, or uppercase. The order of predominance is extremely important. Ingredients must be listed in predominance by weight in the formula. It's not the finished product. It's in the initial formula that's used to make that product. Special provisions are for ingredients that are used at 2% or less, and I asked you what are they, and this is one of the actual questions for the assignment for this particular week's lecture. Common or usual name must be used. It may be a name that's established by a standard, as I talked about jams and jellies as well. Food additives have common or usual names and regulations that were use to approve them. And again, you would need to go, if you didn't know, and wanted to make sure that you were using the correct name, a common name for a food additive, you can go to the regulations looking for food additives, and that will provide you with the common name that was established when that particular food additive was approved for use. Some common or usual names may be established by tradition of use of those particular ingredients. So let's look at some examples. Milk, salt, sugar, jams, jellies, dairy products, again, are ones that would have standards of identity. Milk has a standard of identity as well. Starch, cornstarch, when we see just the term starch, and that can be used as an ingredient. It's a common name. But when we see that, it's referring to that product or that ingredient happened to be cornstarch. And again, one of the questions for this week's assignment is, what about other types of starches? How would they have to be listed on your ingredient list? When we see the term flour, that means that flour is white flour from wheat. And again, we get into, if we're using other types of flour, as with starch, there are other names that need to be used. So only if you see flour in the ingredient list, that means that flour was white flour that had been derived from wheat. Let's look at oil, fats, and oils as well. There are some regulations related to declaration of fats and oils as part of the ingredient statement. Common or usual names are required. Lard, soybean oil, canola oil, olive oil. Those are all examples of common or usual names for the types of oils that we might find being used as ingredients. If it's been hydrogenated or partially hydrogenated, then that needs to be included. So it would say hydrogenated soybean oil or partially hydrogenated soybean oil. If we look at blended fats and oils, you need to list each component separately according to the order of predominance. So if you happen to have blended fats and oils and you're using a blend of corn and soybean oil, and you're using more soybean than corn oil, then soybean oils would appear first, followed by corn oil. List each component if you just put the term vegetable shortening, and that is allowed. And then in parentheses, you would actually put the generic listing of the types of vegetable shortening that would be there. In other words, what was the source of that particular shortening? The same would apply for oils as well. You also see, if you look at labelings very closely, the use of the terms or, and or. So if you see or in the ingredient list, that means that only one of the products in the list is used at any given time. So if the product has an ingredient list that says corn oil or canola oil, that means at any given time they're either going to use corn oil in that product, so it may have corn oil, or it may be, instead of corn oil, maybe canola oil. If we see and or, that means that one or more of the products listed may be used. So if it says corn oil and or canola oil, it may mean that both of those oils are included in that as an ingredient in that particular product. Generic listing of ingredients. This is permitted in some selected cases with some restrictions. Colors, flavors, and spices may be listed generically as flavor, spices, without actually listing the individual spices or flavors that are used. Colors that are subject to certification under 21 CFR 174, they must be listed by the specific name. So FD&C Red 40 or Red 40, that has to be listed as such. It can't just say colors. When we're talking about colors here, we're talking about those colors that would be, say, part of CFR 173, Part 173, that would be from more natural sources, such as beet juice, say, be an example, or blueberry anthocyanins, blueberry juice as an example. Any spices, though, that are commonly used as foods, not just as spices, must be listed separately. So we know onion can be certainly a flavoring, in a food product, as well as garlic, as well as celery. But since they are also consumed directly as individual foods, certainly we eat onions, we'll eat garlic by itself, we'll eat celery by itself, or as a major ingredient in other products, they must be listed specifically. They can't be included in the generic listing. Options for listing standardized foods used as ingredients in another food. It's listed by the common or usual name of the food, followed by a parenthetical listing of all components. And list each component of the standardized food in order of predominance. And my question to you is, why might you select one or the other of these? Let's look at an example. So you're making a product, a new product, and one of the ingredients in your product is going to be, say, Heinz ketchup, as an example. And as you look at the bottle, can, Heinz ketchup, we'll look at bottles in this particular case, and you look at their ingredient list, there's a whole list of ingredients that are part of that ketchup. It's a standardized food. You can include the ingredients in that product in the ingredients for your product in one of two ways. You can list by listing Heinz ketchup and then in parentheses listing all of the ingredients on the ingredient list for Heinz ketchup. Or you can actually figure out how much of those particular ingredients might be in there and then list them as including them with the ingredients that you're listing, say, with your particular food product without stating Heinz ketchup. And one of the questions that I asked you is, why might you select one over the other? What you need to think about is how this might affect where in that ingredient list some of those so-called bad nutrients might fall. Particularly salt or sodium being one, salt, as well as things like saturated fats as well, or sugar as well. So that's what you want to think about when you think about why a company might choose one over the other. Again, many products certainly use leavening agents. They may be declared generically as yeast nutrients, and then you would follow that by a parenthetical listing of each of the ingredients. So if you're using sodium bicarbonate and other leavening agents, yeast itself, that's one way to do it, and you may use or, and or as appropriate to indicate one, all, or one or more of these particular leavening agents are included in that particular product. Preservatives as well are included under some of the labeling requirements. The function of chemical preservatives must be declared. And parenthetical statement such as, say you're using an antioxidant in the product, BHA, BHT, butyl hydroxyanisole, butyl hydroxytoluene. If you have that in then, right in parentheses, right beside that, you would put to retard spoilage. And this is because many consumers certainly would not be familiar with a particular chemical additive that's being put into their product as a preservative, and what the particular function of that particular ingredient might be in that product. And it applies to chemical preservatives only. Okay, so that's what you need to remember. And this is required under the 1938 Federal Food Drug Cosmetic Act. Other preservatives, there are some that actually don't require you to declare them as preservatives, and these are things such as salt, sugar, vinegar. Some of the spices certainly have antimicrobial activity. Smoke and smoking products has some very important antimicrobial activity. And pesticides only comes into play as the fact that we may be applying pesticides post-harvest to a product, herbicides, and the fact that there may be, even if it's applied in the field, there may be some residues, certainly of particular pesticides that may be present in or on that food product. We certainly know that salt has some preservative actions because it certainly can tie up water and reduce water activity. Sugar can do the same. Vinegar is a good acidifying agent, reducing the pH, and in this way being inhibitory and acting as a preservative. Incidental additives do not have to be declared. They're usually part of an ingredient and not functional in the food to which an ingredient is added. So if you're using shortening, there's a couple examples here. If you're using shortening in your food product, that shortening may very oftentimes have antioxidant added to it so that it maintains its quality while it's on the shelf. You do not need to declare that antioxidant that's part of that shortening because it's an incidental additive. And flavors are oftentimes extracted with solvents, and when we remove the solvent in concentrating the flavor, there may be small amounts of that solvent remaining in that flavoring agent. And again, this becomes an incidental additive and it doesn't have to be declared. And again, substances migrating from packaging material or equipment are considered to be incidental additives, and they do not need to be declared in our ingredient list or ingredient statement. Processing aids, it's a type of an incidental additive, so it's exempt from declaration. They're usually present in insignificant levels and do not and are not functional in the finished food. A couple examples here. Enzymes are sometimes added to bread dough to break down the sugar. Amylase is one that oftentimes is used. This would not need to be declared in the ingredient statement. Another example is water. If that water is removed during processing. I put up a couple examples here of cookies and crackers. Another probably good example would be dried pasta, because the water that's used when we actually produce that product is removed during the drying process, so water does not need to be declared as in the ingredient statement, because in this case it becomes an incidental additive. Net quantity of contents. This is required by law to facilitate value comparisons prior to purchase. So if you go to 2 packages of a product that's manufactured by different manufacturers and you find the packages may look the same, but the weight, the amount in each package may be different. The price might be different also, but it allows you to actually compare how much you're getting for per product for a certain amount, so that you can make an educated choice in which particular product you want to purchase that might be the best buy for you. The terms that are used in the net quantity of contents, if that particular food product happens to be a liquid, and it's going to be sold as a liquid, the net quantity is going to be in fluid terms. Could be ounces, could be milliliters. There's a couple examples. Could be liters. If the product happens to be a solid or semi-solid, maybe viscous, something like, say, maple syrup would be a good example. Or a mixture of liquid and solids, say some of the canned fruits, canned vegetables, then the weight is given in grams, pounds, ounces, but in weight terms rather than liquid terms. So it's not going to be liquid fluid ounces, it's going to be ounces in terms of weight. So 16 ounces to a pound. Exception if the general consumer use or trade practices. So if there's been some generally sold in such a fashion, and the consumer would know that, then our trade practices in there would be exempt from this. Another example, if you think of frozen orange juice concentrate, expressed in fluid terms, even though it's sold as a solid, frozen solid, because it's going to be introduced into water and mixed in water, and the product is then going to be consumed as a liquid rather than a solid. The due declaration is required, metric and in each pound, and again, one of the questions that in this week's assignment is which has to be listed first. metric or inch pound, or does it make any difference? The largest whole unit is preferred. If the package happens to weigh 20 ounces, it would be 1.25 pounds rather than 20 ounces. And again, 1 liter rather than 1,000 milliliters. These are the preferred methods of doing it, but it's not required by law. So none of the regulations that we talked about relative to labeling actually requires this, but this is what would be preferred. And you cannot go out to any more than 3 decimal places. Descriptive terms are optional. You can put net weight, net, or net contents, and no qualifying statements are allowed. Things such as a jumbo quart or a full pound. I mean, a quart is a quart and a pound is a pound the world around, as a statement that we hear. And then family size or economy pack can't be used in conjunction with the net quantity statement. Now, you can put family size. You'll see it. I'll give you a good example. Go to Shredded Mini Wheats, which I eat quite a bit. And you can buy it in 2 packaging sizes. They have one that says family size right at the top, but it's not used in conjunction with the net quantity statement. What is meant by the term net is the amount of product the consumer can expect to remove from the package. There are some things that are not included. If you go to the cheese in the pressurized can, that propellant that's there, or say Ready Whipped, another example, that's not, includes the weight of propellant in aerosol packaging, excludes the weight of packaging material, which stands to reason because it's not something you're going to be able to consume. And it excludes the liquid packing medium if the liquid is not intended for consumption. I think a good example here might be olives, because most of us will eat the olives, but we certainly do not consume the liquid brine that the olives are in. The actual location, it's on the principal display panel and all alternate principal display panels. And it has to be in the bottom 30% of the principal display panel, and it's generally parallel to the base of the package. That's a general statement. It doesn't say it has to be, but that's generally where we would find it. What are the separation requirements relative to net quantity contents? They must be separated from the printed material that may be above and below it by the height of the lettering used in the declaration, and from printed material to the left and right by the width of the uppercase letter N or its equivalent. So there are some specific requirements relative to how that net weight content need to be separated from any other material that may be present, printing that may be present on that particular package. It needs to be in a color that is distinct. It's in distinct contrast to the package, so it's very easy for you to see. Typically it's in black in most instances. And it must be prominent and conspicuous by its typography, its layout, color, embossing, and molding. And this is done so that it makes it very, very easy for you as the consumer to determine how much product is actually in that particular package. There are some type size related to the size of the principal display panel. And again, this is only important if you happen to be working for a company and you're working on developing packaging for a particular product, and you have to know what size that net content lettering needs to be, and you know how much or what the size of your principal display panel is in square inches. This allows you to determine what's the minimum type size. It can always be larger, but it has to at least meet these minimums. Name and address of the manufacturer, packer, or distributor must be there. This is required by law, and it must be on either the principal display panel or the information panel. The minimum type size is 1/16 of an inch, and it's usually on the information panel with the ingredient statement and the nutrition data. And no intervening printed material between the required information on the information panel. So again, it has to be readily available again, so you as the consumer, if you have a problem with that particular product, there's someplace you can go in order to get some resolution to your particular issue you might have with that product. Corporate name and address may be used in lieu of the actual place of manufacture. So if a company has several plants, say throughout the United States, where it's making a particular product, but they have a corporate headquarters, they actually may use the address for that corporate headquarters rather than the actual manufacturing plant for that particular product. The name and address of the franchisee, not the franchisor. City, state, and zip code if the street address is in the telephone or city directory. Warnings, self-pressurized containers require a warning statement. Protein diets as well, because of some issues certainly that one can have with high protein diets. And a good example certainly is the use of aspartame and NutraSweet, particularly with people may have phenylketonuria, and certainly you can see this if you go to any of the products that do contain aspartame or NutraSweet. Country of origin, imported foods must have the country name in English, and as I said earlier in the presentation, we'll discuss this later on in the semester because there are some new regulations within the last 4 or 5 years related to country of origin. It took us a long time actually to get passage of some of the regulations related to country of origin. I mean 4 or 5 years actually to come up with a final regulations related to this and the types of products where we have to have country of origin labeling. Nutrition labeling now is required for most foods. Must appear on the label of the packaged products. It must be available to the consumer if the product is unpackaged or the label is small. And we'll look at some types of packaging where the actual label size is small and how you can go about getting the nutrition information if you would like for that particular product. If we look at USDA regulated products, nutrition labeling regulations were actually promulgated, although was not mandated by law. So it's a little different. The 20% of the food products that are regulated by the USDA, Food Safety Inspection Service, regulations were promulgated, but they were never actually mandated by law. But what you're going to see is that they're very similar to the requirements for FDA regulated products. Restaurants, well, we got to a point where we're actually looking at requiring information to be available, certainly, to you if you go to a restaurant. And I think if you look at the restaurant menus, and certainly the large chains, you're going to see that that information is present. And this became law in May 7th of 2018, requiring calorie and nutrition information. And in order to be required to do this, chains with 20 or more locations are required to provide this information. Now, some of them have done it well before, certainly it was required. So they need to provide the number of calories in standard items on the menu or on a menu board. And then upon request, they have to have available to you total calories, total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol, sodium, total carbs, sugar, fiber, and protein. These all have to be available to you if you request them. I think if you look at Applebee's is one that I've certainly seen their menu, and they do provide the total calories for that particular product, and if that product can be consumed in different forms, they actually provide you with information relative to both forms. And also written information available upon request based on a 2,000 calorie per day diet, and this is used for the general nutrition advice. So we do have now for chains of 20 or more locations available to you if you'd like nutrition information. For the nutrition facts, as we look at them for food products that we're buying in the supermarket, we're required to have a serving size, amount per serving, calories, calories from fat, total fat, saturated fat, trans fat, cholesterol. And as we look at the old nutrition facts label, which is to the left, and then we look at the new label, you're going to see that serving sizes Calories are much larger in terms of print size. They're a little different. Serving sizes have been redefined when we get into the new regulations related to the nutritional facts label. And you'll see a couple other changes as well that are easy to note. We'll see now that we no longer have vitamin A or vitamin C required because they're not felt, at least by experts, to be that much of an issue, certainly with diets in the United States. But instead, we've added vitamin D, which tends sometimes certainly to be an issue in the U.S., particularly more in colder climates perhaps than in those southern climates where they have access to high UV light throughout most of the year. And then we've also included potassium, because potassium-sodium ratios are extremely important, particularly as we look at people who are looking at reduced sodium as well. So there were some changes. The label, the nutrition facts label on the right is the new label that's required for food products. So we have sodium, again, total carbohydrates, dietary fiber, total sugars. We have added sugars. This is an important one. I'm going to have a discussion question for you this week related to this issue of added sugars. And some issues that were taken with particularly Industry in Maine relative to having to include added sugars on the nutritional label. Then total protein, and then daily values, vitamin D, calcium, iron, and potassium. So new label, what's different? I leave this for you to go over as you take time to look at both the slide as well as the changes that were required in terms of changes in type size, so it's more easily seen by the consumer. Consumers certainly are very, very concerned, or have been, many consumers anyway, concerned with calories, and then making the serving sizes larger and in bolder type so it's easier to see. And then there have been updates in serving sizes, and we'll look at that very, very briefly as well. Reference amounts commonly consumed certainly have been changed due to consumption patterns and what one would usually see individuals actually consuming at an individual meal. This applies, say, to something like a can of soup, where it might say 2 servings, when in most instances an individual is probably going to eat that whole can of soup as a single serving. So here's some food serving sizes, as I say, get a reality check. If we look at what was the current or older serving size, and say some ice cream, it was 4 servings per container, per pint. And then there would be 200 calories. But that's not what we usually consume. Most consumers are going to consume actually about 270 grams of that particular ice cream, say. And that means we only have 3 servings in that particular pint of ice cream. And then we get down to soda again. Whether it's a 12 or 20 ounce bottle of soda, those are both considered to be 1 serving, because the individual is probably going to, if they're going to have a 12 ounce or a 20 ounce, they're probably going to consume that as a single serving. Other vitamins and minerals may be declared if they are naturally present, and they must be declared if they're added. So a company does have the option of including other vitamins and minerals in their nutrition label. If they would like. Don't see a lot of them doing that if they're naturally present. But remember, they must be declared if they're actually added. So when we get to milk or dairy products and margarine, it's required for skim milk to add vitamin A, because it's removed in removing the cream, or a lot of it, because it's fat soluble. And all milk we add vitamin D to. So those have to be included in our nutritional statement, nutritional labeling. And when we get into baked products, in particular cereals, bakery products, where we're adding flour or rice, because there was a law requiring during World War II that these vitamins are removed during the processing, then they are added back, and you'll see this on cereal. Then you are required to put on your nutrient label these particular vitamins and iron as well. For the fact that certainly they're being removed and they're required by law to actually fortify with these. Folic acid actually is a new addition. We'll talk about that a little bit later when we talk about health claims. The complying date, manufacturers would have until, remember I said it was passed in 2018, they would have till 2020 to comply with the final requirements. And manufacturers that have less than $10 million in annual food sales, they get an extra year to actually implement the changes. You're going to see that many other manufacturers have already done this. Really wasn't that difficult for them to actually comply. They just needed time to use up old packaging material that they had in stock, so they didn't have to have an economic loss of actually throwing out or destroying that particular packaging material. Imported foods are required to meet the same requirements as products that are produced domestically. So anything that's coming into the U.S. needs to meet our requirements in terms of labeling of those particular products. Allergen labeling came about in January of 2006. What is required? Remember, any of you who have a food allergy certainly probably pay attention to the allergy labeling statements on food products. The FDA, along with scientists, based on scientific evidence, identified 8 foods that were predominantly responsible for probably more than 80% of the allergic food allergen reactions in the United States, and those were then required to be included within the labeling of food products. Milk, eggs, fish, crustacean shellfish, tree nuts, peanuts, wheat, and soybeans are the 8. So if we look at allergen labeling, how do they do it? Well, if we look at a couple ways they can do it, we see a label here, and we have enriched flour, and then in parentheses they put wheat flour. We get down to whey. Whey is an ingredient from dairy, from milk. If whey is added, then in parentheses they put milk. And then we get down to lecithin. Lecithin typically comes from soy, although it can also be isolated from egg yolk. So if the lecithin is coming from soy, it would say in parentheses soy. If that lecithin is coming from egg yolk, it would say egg, because again, egg is one of the 8 most common food allergens. It must specify the type of tree nut. Peanuts are included in the case by themselves, but other nuts such as cashews, walnuts, any other type of nut, pistachios, they have to be specified as that particular type of nut. And you must specify the type of crustacean shellfish, lobster, crab, whatever. And you must specify the type of fish. So there are, within the general categories, for these 3 in particular, there are further requirements in terms of labeling. A second option, rather than put it in parentheses, is to place the word contains followed by the name of source of the food. And an example I gave you down here, a particular food product that we looked at before, they may say, rather than put it in parentheses after the ingredient, say contains wheat, milk, and soy. An additional statement that may be put on is may add manufactured in a plant using peanuts, may say walnuts, etc., etc., so that if the company happens to be manufacturing a product that doesn't have peanuts, but they're also handling peanuts in that product, and it's possible that some small amounts of peanut material may be included in that product, they may put this on the label as well to let people who have peanut allergies, which can be very, very severe, as we know, to maybe not purchase that product, not take a chance that some extraneous peanut material got included into that particular product. And here's an example of one of my favorite candy bars, Sky Bar. These bars were available when I was a kid. You can still buy them, but they're not very prevalent anymore. But it says here at the very bottom of the label, after the ingredients, it says allergen information. It contains milk, eggs, peanuts, and soy. And then below that, they said manufactured, made in a facility that also processes tree nuts and wheat, so that the consumer, again, has that option of determining if they really want to consume that product. Other voluntary declarations: poly and monosaturated fatty acids, other carbohydrates, sugar alcohols, soluble and insoluble fiber, and potassium. Potassium is actually now required. It's no longer voluntary. It has to be on the nutrient label. In terms of allergen labeling, actually, FDA is currently reviewing the scientific evidence that actually may result in adding an additional food to the required allergen labeling requirements, and that happens to be sesame. There seems to be quite a bit of scientific evidence out there that would indicate that a fair number of people can have an allergic reaction to sesame. So we may find in the very near future that we may have a ninth allergen adding to our most common food allergens, of that being sesame. Some websites where you can find information relative to labeling food products. If we look at labeling of alcoholic beverages, and I put this in here because it's not controlled by the FDA. Labeling of alcoholic beverages is controlled under the Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives Bureau. But within that organization, and this is sort of pertinent because we certainly have a lot of craft breweries, breweries starting up in Maine, and I can't remember, we have over 60, I believe, a number I saw at one point, craft brewers. And they must get approval for all of their labels. And that approval is gotten through the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Trade Bureau. So there is labeling requirements for alcoholic beverages, so every can that a product that they manufacture that might have several different labels, actually, because they have several different types of products that they're making, different types of beer, then they all have to get approval for the labels or for the material that's on that can in terms of labeling. When you get to see this particular video and see these particular slides, if we're still in the government shutdown, this could have a big impact, certainly, on some of these craft brewers in terms of getting approval for their labels, if we're still in that shutdown. Website for nutritional facts, label changes that occur. And this document would be certainly revised as new material and new regulations come into place. And finally, food trivia question: what is the original flavor of the filling in Twinkies? That's kind of interesting, actually, what it actually happens to be.